Welcome to Oh God, What Now? I'm Dorian Linsky. In today's show, Keir Starmer has caused a fuss by meeting hard-right Italian Prime Minister Giorgia Meloni to talk immigration. With so many dictators and right-wing populists in power around the world, what are the ethical limits of Labour's diplomacy? Plus, Sir Ed Davey has told the Lib Dem conference that the party will replace the Tories as the official opposition at the next election. Is that credible, or is he getting out over his jet skis? And in the extra bit for supporters, why is space so boring now? At least that's what John Elledge claims in a piece for the New Statesman.
God, not that.
We'll discuss whether this, like everything else, is Elon Musk's fault. Let's meet today's panel. First, Westminster editor for the Lead, Zoe Grunewald. Hi, Zoe.
Hello.
So Starmer's foes have been whipping up a scandal over clothes donated to his wife, Victoria, by Labour donor Wahid Ali. What has Starmer allegedly done wrong?
So it was thought that Sir Keir Starmer had potentially broken parliamentary rules in failing to declare clothes bought for his wife by Lord Ali. So this was a Sunday Times revelation, which we know that Lord Ali is a major donor to the Labour Party. He had a pass to number 10 over the summer. He's donated personal items to Sir Keir Starmer, and he'd also donated a personal shopper and alterations to Starmer's wife, Victoria, both before and after the general election. The Prime Minister did approach parliamentary authorities to make a late declaration. He said he'd later been given advice to do so, to include the donations made to his wife. A number 10 spokesperson said Sir Keir believed he had complied with the rules but had since declared further items. Now, Parliament's standards watchdog has said it will not be investigating whether Starmer broke the rules by not declaring clothes, presumably because he eventually did declare it, just declared it late.
So it's a teeny scandal, but is this the price Starmer pays for taking such a rigorously ethical whiter-than-white stance? I mean, he does love a free gig ticket.
He does.
He's been milking Wembley Stadium.
Yes, he does. He's had more tickets and gifts than any other recent party leader, and I think there's two problems with this. The first is that Keir Starmer made a huge virtue during his campaign of wanting to put real clear water between himself and the Tories. You know, he referred a lot to the scandal and the cronyism of Boris Johnson years, and how that had touched the rest of, the successive Tory administrations. And there was a whole chapter in the Labour manifesto about restoring public service and how they would restore trust. So that's one of the problems. The other is that there is the wider political and economic context that this occurred. This was the next big piece of news just after Keir Starmer was in a row about taking payments away from vulnerable pensioners. And lots of discussion about Labour presiding over a really difficult set of economic circumstances. There's no money. So there's the optics of both of these problems. And I think, since Starmer has decided to make standards and ethics such an important part of his politics, which I think is really important, that comes with extra responsibilities. And I think being really, really hot on these things, making sure you declare everything, you're whiter than white, and, everything is above board.
If I was Prime Minister, I would expect a free Taylor Swift ticket, though.
Oh, God, yeah.
But I would get cheaper glasses. His glasses, apparently, just seem wildly expensive.
But his glasses have been such a talking point, and they seem to represent when he was ready for government. There was something about those glasses even before we realised they'd been donated.
Power specs.
Yes, yeah.
So like Cyclops from the X-Men.
Maybe this is why I'm not Prime Minister. Possibly the only reason. And that was author and columnist John Elledge and space hater. Hi, John.
Hello. Bloody hate it. It's rubbish up there. It's nothing there.
Sadiq Khan has approved plans to pedestrianise Oxford Street. He says it will revitalise a fading shopping hotspot. But the Daily Mail shrieks that removing cars will turn the street into, quote, a crime-ridden no-go zone hellhole.
No one ever does crime in cars, so that tracks.
It's quite hard to say no-go zone hellhole. I would just go for hell zone. Anyway, you like urban planning. What do you think?
I mean, it's a good idea. Oxford Street's rubbish. Have you been there recently? Deeply depressing place, and has been for at least 10 years. Whether it will happen, I don't know, because I think this is basically the plan that was first wheeled out in about 2015. So it's been talked about for a while, but it did kind of all collapse in upon itself, because the difficulty you've got, one of the things that makes Oxford Street so horrible is this kind of canyon full of buses. Like most of the traffic on Oxford Street is buses with the occasional cab. So to pedestrianise it, you need to reroute all those. They probably go down streets like Wigmore Street, which is just north of Oxford Street. And the residents up there complain. A lot of the shopkeepers on Oxford Street also complain because people have got it into their heads that if you can't literally drive to a place in the centre of London, you will get no traffic. You'll get no custom. Like I remember in 2003, when they first brought in the congestion charge, the Evening Standard managed to get a quote out the guy who ran the cigarette concession at Elephant and Castle Tube Station, saying he thought it would kill his business. And it's like, you are selling fags at a tube station. Who is driving to you? But this is what some people genuinely, I don't know if it's actually because it's easy to get stock in or something, but so people, actually there often don't like it. And all the residents complain because they think it'll mean more traffic on their roads. And it's the residents who get to vote for the council. So I think last time round it was knocked back by Westminster Council when it was still run by the Tories. Now it is run by Labour, but they've not been massively keen on these sort of things either for basically the same reason. So it would be great, but we'll see.
So I was looking in the Daily Mail piece for Hell's Own Evidence, and they had one cabbie going, well, the lights from cars, the busyness and lights from cars make people feel safer.
Especially when they're coming towards them at 40 miles an hour or something. Yeah.
I was like, is that true?
But no one complained when they did it to Carnaby Street. And well, I mean, we
No,
can't.
they did.
I can't back that up at all. But I'm going to. That's the assertion I'm going with. So you can't correct me, John. In 1973, and also Walthamstow Village, that has been a real success pedestrianising.
No, they're
that
always a
area.
success. Once they've done it, everyone loves it. It's just persuading people to take cars out of anything means a lot of whinging. And Oxford Street as it stands is just... It's just deeply depressing. If you kind of re-envisioned it as this kind of public space rather than this kind of thoroughfare, then you would get people hanging out there. You would probably it would improve the shops. There would be more trade. But getting from here to there involves overcoming a lot of opposition. So we'll see.
Well, I like the artist mock-ups, which always have a lot of happy people and plants. It's very pleasant.
Those are both good things. I think we can get behind that.
Rounding out the panel, political correspondent for Politics Joe, Ava Santina. Hi, Ava.
Hello.
You've just produced a video report on the influence of American money on the UK anti-abortion movement.
Yes,
What are they up to?
It's the same groups, but the UK arm of the American groups that took down Roe v. Wade. So the groups that you saw protesting in Washington, D.C., like 40 Days for Life, who held these huge protests and were very excited when Roe v. Wade was overturned. But it's not the abortion element of this that I think is the most important. It's the sort of ideology that they're driving at, which is separate spheres for men and women, traditional gender roles. And the way in which they're going about this is lobbying certain MPs. So they're taking them on trips, they're providing a lot of pamphlets that are getting into parliamentary offices in a way that perhaps normal campaign groups can't access parliamentary offices. And what's sort of sinister about it is the money is dark. And by that, I mean, you can't trace it. You're not sure where it's coming from. There's, they argue that this is all coming from small Christian donors who just care about abortion. But actually, it seems more likely that it's coming from huge investors who have a vested interest in this sort of separate spheres ideology.
Because we're much less religious than the US. Abortion hasn't been such a hot political topic. And the people who are most concerned about these kind of, this very rigid, almost like Christian nationalist vibe, people like Miriam Cates, former MP, thank God, are quite fringe. But in your video, Stella Creasy warns that we could be sleepwalking into a backlash. So where is the real danger despite the cultural differences?
Well, it's interesting you bring up Miriam Cates because when we first learned that she had these sort of evangelist tendencies was at the National Conservative Convention. And that is an event that is held at the Emmanuel Centre, which is near Tufton Street. And, Tufton Street is sort of the home of dark money and lobbying groups. It's just very interesting, this sort of slow creep of American evangelicism. It's not Christianity. It's sort of it's a hard right conservatism that is creeping into our politics. So that's what Stella Creasy's warning about. Also about the criminalisation of abortion that's happening. There are many women who've experienced stillbirths and they found when they've been brought to hospital that they've had a police officer at the end of their beds, which is extraordinary. And this has only happened in the last 5 years or so.
Well, it's very good. You should go and watch it. Let's begin. Keir Starmer took a trip to Italy earlier this week to talk to its populist right Prime Minister Giorgia Meloni about irregular immigration policy. Italy has made deals with Tunisia and Libya to reduce small boat crossings at the source and negotiated with Albania to process asylum claims. Meloni has also built more detention centres and penalised charity ships for rescuing migrants in peril. Now, rivals have more than half this year, but human rights groups have protested. Our friend Zoe Gardner has called the Albania scheme a human rights disaster waiting to happen. To nobody's surprise, the Starmer-Meloni meeting has unsettled many Labour MPs. Ava, this is a fact-finding mission, but can the UK learn much from Italy's approach? I mean, there's a really big difference there that migrants come to Italy direct from North Africa. They come here via the continent, so we're in quite a different situation. And obviously Albania is not the same as the Rwanda scheme, but it's reminding people of it.
Well, the argument from Labour is that having closer ties to Italy would potentially stem the flow of migrants who are attempting to cross the English Channel, because migrants come from Africa and they make their way to Italy, and then once they're in Italy, they can travel freely through France and then make their way to the UK. So that's the sort of the tie, I suppose, that Starmer is trying to forge. But the upset from Labour MPs is Giorgia Meloni's approach to countering, the number of asylum seekers that are able to reach Italy. And essentially what Meloni has done is she's made this deal with the Tunisian president where Tunisian authorities now sort of grab people who are in the sea or are attempting to make their way toward Italy, and they deport them. And there have been many reports of these asylum seekers being treated horrifically. And so the means in which she's cut migration are rather ugly, and that's the objection that Labour MPs have. Also, notably, her Deputy Prime Minister is on trial for, this NGO boat that was parked outside Italy for quite some time, where all of these asylum seekers were trapped. They weren't allowed to dock in Italy, and it was a horrific situation. There was an epidemic of scabies. The conditions were so awful on this boat that people were flinging themselves into the sea because they would rather die than be on that boat. So the argument from Labour MPs is not sort of the diplomacy of Meloni, and should you be friends with someone who has said, well, arguably anti-Semitic tropes, or many other things that she has said that are homophobic. That's not the argument against meeting with her. It's, should a centre-left government be associating with or endorsing some of the tactics that she has implemented?
Diane Abbott called Meloni a literal fascist. She did start out in the neo-fascist MSI, which was formed from the ashes of Mussolini's regime in 1946, which is pretty fascist, and was president of its successor, the Brothers of Italy. On Meloni, how fascist is she?
I mean, what is the scale for a fascist? Essentially, I mean, she's almost more like our Boris Johnson. So Boris Johnson, where he was sort of Teflon-like in that he could say pretty horrific comments throughout his tenure as Prime Minister and the years that preceded that, and none of them really seemed to stick. So she has made homophobic slurs, anti-Semitic remarks, and for some reason no one seems too bothered about this because she doesn't associate herself with some of the more right-wing fringe groups in Italian government.
And she hasn't done the pro-Putin thing. She's sort of good on Ukraine. And so there's various ways in which she's not moderate, but moderate compared to the absolute freaks of the European right.
Well, I suppose the reason that I'm likening her to Boris Johnson is that you could argue from, you could have said that Boris Johnson wasn't part of the fringe groups like the Brexit Party or UKIP. And so therefore he must be somewhat moderate. Yeah. That's how she appears. But actually, he was engaging in some pretty poor behaviour.
But there's a pre-election speech from Meloni. She's toned this down, but she literally, like a supervillain speech, yes to the natural family, no to the LGBT lobby, yes to sexual identity, no to gender ideology, no to Islamist violence, yes to secure borders, no to mass migration, no to big international finance, no to the bureaucrats of Brussels. So you can see why she doesn't seem like a natural friend of the Labour Party.
But you read that out, and most of those things, I think Ava's right, those could almost entirely be coming out of the mouth of Boris Johnson. And actually, like, people didn't generally call him a fascist. I mean, my mate Jim does, but most people, even who object strongly to him, would not use that word for him. There is this kind of sort of nasty right-wing politics that doesn't quite cross that line, isn't there?
And there's a lot of it. John, so how is the government spinning this meeting?
Basically, they're talking about it as if it's pragmatism, seems to be the line. So they are sending money, which I thought was interesting, but it's not very much money. It's about 4 million, which is, I mean, I could do 4 million, but that's pocket change for the government. So I assume that's in some way meant to be sort of more about signalling than actual achievement, whether to the Italian government or to the voters, I'm not sure. They're not ruling anything out, but the idea that the UK is going to copy this Albania thing seems to actually come from Meloni. Like, she's the one who said the UK government has shown great interest in the agreement, which makes me think that's probably actually aimed at her domestic audience, going, look, this is quite a reasonable thing that a left-wing British government could do.
Albania itself is saying no.
Absolutely not.
It's not.
Yeah, it's a one-time deal.
Yeah.
Albania and Italy are quite close allies. Albania is not.
They're quite close together also.
They are, yeah. And, well, of course, Albania was once an Italian colony, of course, as were we. But yeah, Starmer himself seems...
Just let it go, John.
Sorry.
It's a long time ago.
Anyway, Starmer doesn't seem particularly interested in the Albania thing, actually. He's kind of seems much more interested in kind of the bit where Italy is also making deals with the North African countries that people are coming through. So, quote, I've always made the argument that preventing people leaving their country in the first place is far better than trying to deal with those that have arrived. And a spokesperson kind of later reiterated that. So I think actually a lot of it, people are getting worked up over not a huge amount, I think.
But I mean, if there was sign of simultaneously improving safe routes, which is the more sort of humane and I suppose progressive solution, perhaps people wouldn't get so worked up. But if the only noises about immigration are just checking out my Mussolini loving pal over here.
Yeah, there's absolutely nothing about this. So I did kind of look up when Starmer was last talking about safe routes. And as far as I can tell, it was May when he said safe routes are not the answer, which is not brilliant.
It's not brilliant because they sort of could be.
They could. I mean, I think they would certainly help, wouldn't they? The other thing.
Sorry, would that imply that danger routes are the answer? What's the alternative?
It's safe routes, danger routes, or no routes, right?
Right. Yeah.
I think the argument is basically that if it's only incredibly dangerous to do it, then that's a deterrent. Mm-hmm. And if we suddenly had safe routes, then lots more people would be claiming asylum. I am not sure I buy that argument. And I also think, like, if you kind of look at all the terrible things that are going to happen to the planet because of climate change in the 21st century, I think people are going to be doing a lot of moving about, whether or not the government is briefing the Daily Mail about how horrible it is for refugees or not. But I think that is the argument.
Zoe, I mean, obviously, given the size and influence of Italy, you've got to meet Meloni at G7 summits or whatever. Are you more sort of troubled by this? That this is a sort of a special trip on a particularly, flammable issue, and that obviously he's not signing up to everything that she's said and done, but a lot of that is pretty dark.
I mean, there's clearly a difference between, to put it in kind of silly terms, running into somebody, a world leaders summit, and hi, you all right, let's pose for the picture, and actively saying you're going over to meet them on a state visit and you're going to take photos and you're going to learn a thing or two about what they do in that country. I think when it comes to Europe, there are some good signals here in that Starmer is clearly trying to meet with more European leaders and trying to extend some of those kind of olive branches and shore up his relationship with Brussels. And Meloni is kind of skeptical of the EU, but actually she does work within the confines of it, and she is seen as Italy is seen as a member of, as quite an active member of that. So, if you are a Europhile, you might be actually just quite pleased that Starmer is speaking to those leaders, as much as we don't like that parts of Europe are shifting to the right. The problem here is obviously that there are so many objectionable things, as has been said out, with how Meloni approaches immigration. The thing you could say is that actually Starmer's in quite a difficult position in that here in the UK, there is quite a vocal right-wing lobby who love to say that the government is not doing anything on immigration and is sticking their fingers in their ears and refusing to acknowledge some of the arguments put forward by the right. Now he is going to meet somebody who has implemented these, and he could easily come back and say, we've learned a lot, and what we've learned is those things don't necessarily align with what we want to do here, and here's the reasons why they might not work. As you say, they're different crossings for a start. So I don't think necessarily going and speaking to that leader is a bad thing. It's how he implements what he learns, if he implements what he learns.
Because Starmer also said recently that delivery and honesty is the best way of dealing with the snake oil of populism and nationalism. And, people like Meloni are delivering the snake oil of populism and nationalism. And Gordon Brown in The Guardian made a slightly different point that the centre-right parties in Europe have empowered the far right by accepting anti-immigration priorities, if not welcoming them into coalition. So, delivery and honesty sound very good. It's a sign of how Starmer is going to sort of walk that line with it, without doing the kind of, you want to kind of take away the issues that fire up the populist right, but you don't take them away by just sort of doing a different version of them.
I think it's a really difficult line to tread. I think what Labour should be doing and should be making clear is that, as I set out before, there are interests in meeting their European neighbours, working closer with the EU. Some of their shared values are not just kind of the economy, but also things like the security of the EU, and every country has an interest in keeping its borders safe. But that doesn't mean you share the values or the methods of a right-wing government. You might talk about how you can share resources. You might talk about how you're going to share intel, which is something he's been speaking about for a long time, how he wants to have this cross-border force, how he wants to share information with the French, the rest of Europe. I think that's all perfectly important and reasonable. But, the thing that is missing, and the thing that Labour could be criticised for, is if they don't keep some of that, Labour humanity in their immigration policy. And that means safe and legal routes, or it at least means talking about, refugees and asylum seekers in far more humane ways than we've seen the Tory government and Giorgia Meloni's government as well.
I think it perhaps is a bigger problem with Labour at the moment, is that they keep forgetting to do the Labour stuff. They do all the stuff that's very hard and painful for Labour, but not just like the stuff that Labour likes doing.
It's almost like you can imagine why they were tough on these things when they were trying to get elected, but they've sort of slightly drank the Kool-Aid a little bit, and it's like, okay, but now you're in government, you can be a little bit softer.
You can do something that Labour MPs like.
Yeah.
John, the left can be a bit slippery on this, because people who defended Corbyn meeting terrorists, on the justification that, well, if you don't meet them, how are you ever going to negotiate and how are you ever going to get peace? Obviously are furious if there's a picture of David Lamy shaking hands with Netanyahu. So, is the truth that you basically always have to talk to some bastards, and that when you have your photo taken with them, you can't just pull a face like, I don't really like this. You do have to smile, and that ultimately you're judged by what you get out of it. Like, does it work? Like, it doesn't seem like there's any sort of hard and fast rules on who you do and do not talk to.
I do think a crucial difference between Jeremy Corbyn back in the day and Keir Starmer now is that Keir Starmer is Prime Minister and therefore can go and talk to other world leaders. I do think that is probably part of the job if you're a world leader. If you are the UK Prime Minister, you probably are going to have to talk to the Prime Minister of Italy at some point. You're probably going to have to talk to Donald Trump if he is re-elected. And we can hate these people, but nonetheless, you're going to have to talk to the leaders of our allies. And I don't think that necessarily applies in quite the same way to backbench MPs campaigning on specific issues. I think the other difference of the Corbyn thing, as with Priti Patel doing her secret negotiations with Israel when she was International Development Secretary, the tell is that when people do that stuff, they're only talking to one side. Like Jeremy Corbyn was never saying, we also have to talk to Likud or there's never going to be peace, which is just as legitimate an argument. I'm really, really getting myself.
So is that basically the thing is, do you just talk to everybody? If that's what you do as Prime Minister, is just basically, or Foreign Secretary, you just basically talk to everybody.
I think the idea of getting annoyed with a Prime Minister for talking to another Prime Minister is silly, is what I'm saying here.
But I think
making a big thing about it is maybe sort of going over there and saying, hey, maybe the Italians have solutions. I think that's the problem, not the fact there's going to be a photo of him with Meloni.
I shouldn't have interrupted you because, yes, I think that's what the problem is. It's the argument that should you be going to meet the Italian Prime Minister to discuss how she's stemming the flow of asylum seekers when you know that it's because Tunisian authorities are grabbing people and deporting them to Libya where they are being extorted and tortured. That is not something that a centre-left Prime Minister should be doing. But on meeting world leaders, what did you say when, was it Sunak or was it Johnson invited Mohammed bin Salman to Downing Street? And people were very upset about that at the time. I imagine you would have written some sort of column on that.
I absolutely did not touch that one with a barge pole, no.
Your silence is deafening.
Yeah.
I can't have opinions about everything.
This is very interesting, isn't it? Because you have opinions about television. Ava, the question of how Labour would deal with the second Trump administration has been kicking around for a long time, long before they won the election. Obviously, you've got to work with the US, whoever's in charge. You can't just not speak to the president. Given what David Lamy has said in the past, would this be bad news for him, a Trump win?
So the view from one former Conservative Foreign Secretary is that the Americans will not touch the UK Prime Minister if they know that David Lamy is in situ, if there is a Trump administration. The view inside the Foreign Office for civil servants is that it would be impossible to organise some sort of meeting between the Trump administration and the UK Foreign Office if he were still Secretary of State. And actually, the view inside Labour is also Lamy's days are probably numbered if there is to be a Trump administration.
So he's going to be in for a tense night on election night, more than most.
No, he will be. And, I think that, so Labour really bargained on, they put David Lamy in that position as Foreign Sec because he has a long relationship with the Obamas, and they thought that would translate into a good relationship with the Biden lot. It actually didn't really come to fruition. That relationship sort of petered out in a way that Labour weren't particularly pleased about. The lack of foresight to criticise an American president, there was, I think the average spectator could have told you when Trump lost the last election that he would be back. And if you are someone in politics, to criticise him, I just think is extraordinary behaviour. You probably shouldn't hold that office.
But I remember when we had David Lamy on the podcast when it was Romaniacs, and he was just, he was a spicy opinion machine back then. And it is that sort of that transition from being a kind of, really quite sort of loud and proud principal backbencher to being in that shadow minister and then a minister. And so I'm sure he's sort of kicking himself over the lively views he expressed. But he wasn't wrong.
No, he's not wrong. But that's not good politicking, is it? But then also you could make the argument that his dealings with Israel-Gaza have been made more difficult by his involvement with the Palestine movement over the past decade. Should you never say anything if you expect that perhaps one day you might become Foreign Secretary?
Well, I'm fucked. It's not just the glasses that is blocking me from a career at the top of politics. It's my spicy takes over 7 years of this podcast. So hopefully, I'm hoping obviously that Trump doesn't win and therefore Lamy will still be around. Before the election, he talked about his foreign policy philosophy of progressive realism. Are we any clearer about what that means in practice?
I think we saw the clearest version of this from Lamy's own mouth earlier this week when he gave his speech about how climate policy would kind of be at the heart of a lot of his foreign policy, because essentially progressive realism is using realist means to pursue progressive ends. So it's kind of understanding that you might have to do some things as foreign secretary, meet some people, make some concessions that you wouldn't necessarily want to do in a perfect world, but everything you will do with the intention of countering climate change, defending democracy, advancing economic growth and tackling inequality. To me, it sounds a bit cakey. It's like, I want to be a tough foreign secretary, but I'll be able to achieve all the things I want to do. And it's also a bit, it's slightly kind of, yes, I am Labour and I want all these progressive things, but I also will be a really good, tough foreign secretary. And it's a bit kind of throwing some meat to the
I mean,
undecided
suppose it's
Tory
what
voters.
anyone would want to be. Any what Labour Foreign Secretary tried to do. He goes, I'm going to have to do some bad shit,
Yeah.
but it's in the name of some good
Exactly.
shit. So sort of trust me, bro. I'm going to get to that.
Exactly. And, I wonder, I think Ava makes a good point that there are some murmurs about Lamy's future as Foreign Secretary and how long he would maybe stay in that role. And I did find actually his speech interesting because it seemed sort of slightly out of step with some of what we've heard from Labour recently. And I think, we know Ed Miliband's really focused on climate policy and Lamy is too. But I just wonder if they still are in that phase of slightly wanting to dampen down some of their progressiveness, because it seems to me like they're still slightly in electioneering mode and not being as kind of progressive as we thought Labour might be at this point.
I do think at least some of this is confected, though, in that, like, I have seen this phrase doing the rounds of describing the Albania thing, which Starmer has said he is not interested in, as I can't believe it's not Rwanda. And like, firstly, if you look at it, there are some clear differences. With
Massive differences, like about where you end up when you've been processed.
It's like, if it is run by Italian civil servants, and if you successfully claim asylum, you get to live in Italy. It is not being outsourced wholesale to a foreign government, and then maybe you get to stay in Rwanda. It's a completely different thing. But it just kind of feels to me like there's a lot of people in the right-wing press and probably beyond who just want to go, you scrapped Rwanda, but now you're going to do this other thing. And that's not actually what Starmer said at all.
He's going to pedestrianise Rwanda. That's what he's going to do, like all Labour governments.
Put lots of plants in there. Moving on, the Liberal Democrats gathered in Brighton for their first conference since their best ever general election result, 72 seats to the Tories' 121. In his closing speech, Ed Davey directed most of his fire at the Tories, promising to finish the job and take their place as the official opposition. The speech ended with Sweet Caroline and a shower of gold confetti, like a Coldplay concert. John, you were there in Brighton. Was it as fun as it looked?
Unbelievably, it was probably actually less fun than it looked. I quite like Lib Dem conference. Because like they're a pleasant but slightly odd group of people, so kind of make kind of like fascinating company for a couple of days, and also they do all sorts of fun things. Like the floor debates actually matter. That is where the Liberal Democrats set policy, so the leadership can lose a vote. So like someone can win the membership round with a good speech. It is like exactly the kind of unstaged managed politics you don't get at the bigger conferences. So it's often been quite fun to be at in the past, but this one was so incredibly boring because everyone's in such a good mood. Like everyone's incredibly happy. So from a journalistic point of view, it was unbelievably dull.
Can you just be happy for them, John?
I am quite happy for them. I just also had 2,000 words to fill.
So how did Davey talk about Labour? What did you get from the speech about his vision of constructive opposition?
So they are, I mean, some of the outlines of the things they're going to be campaigning on are the same ones as in the election. So we're going to hear a lot about kind of, basic failures of the state, like the sewage and the water supply problem or the care crisis, which Davey is personally obviously very passionate about. They are stepping up campaigning on the NHS. There was a line in the speech about how the NHS was actually invented by a Liberal, William Beveridge, which everyone enjoyed very much.
I mean,
from some perspectives.
Half true.
But no, basically they think this is a bruise they're going to be able to punch quite well because the Tories obviously can't own this issue because they created this shitstorm. But Labour are not likely to be able to fix it fast enough. They're going to have to make some difficult decisions. And people are going to be very frustrated with like not being able to get a GP appointment or being on a very, very long waiting list. So basically the Lib Dems have seen a gap in the market for a party that talks endlessly about the NHS but doesn't actually have to fix it anytime soon.
Well, Davey and most of the party lean left, but they won most of their seats.
I would actually question Davey. He was an Orange Booker.
But he's certainly not. He certainly seems to the left of Clegg now.
I think that's...
Or is he just following the party?
I think to an extent it's a broadly social democratic party.
Okay.
But also like, so someone quite senior on the sort of backroom side of the Lib Dems that put it to me that like just the sort of mainstream of politics now is more to the left of where it was 10, 15 years ago because things are broken and we need to fix them.
Okay, so maybe this is less of an issue than I thought because they won most of their seats to the Tories. The target seats for the next election are mostly held by Tories. Is it going to be a big problem to retain and win those former Tory voters without moving right?
I do think there's going to be a tension here because the membership is broadly, I think it's more left than right. And, there's a huge amount of social liberalism in there as well, obviously. But some of the issues they're talking about campaigning on are going to be those that they think will play well in those Tory-held blue wall seats. Like I think 26 of their next 30 targets are currently Tory. So we're probably going to hear them opposing the introduction of VAT on school fees.
It's not very progressive, Ed.
No, it's not very progressive at all. They're also going to be fighting the planning bill quite hard, I think. And this is going to, I think in a couple of years, we're going to start seeing civil war on the Liberal Democrat conference floor again.
Well,
so future conferences might be more fun.
It does make you think. We were saying that obviously election day was maybe as good as it got for Labour, at least so far. But maybe also for the Lib Dems and the Greens, that all these kind of really, quite fractious coalitions under the surface with some really major disagreements. And they just all had a wonderful kind of like, we're not the Tories kind of day there of celebration. And but all those differences are going to come out.
I mean, the flip side is I actually think that the Greens might be all right because they have quite a cuddly brand. Like I think one of the frustrations I heard from a lot of the Lib Dems is that the Greens can kind of fill the gap that the Lib Dems filled in the noughties of taking disaffected Labour voters in urban areas. Those guys are probably going to go to the Greens now because it seems like it's an easier brand to communicate. And the average voter doesn't know that Adrian Ramsey opposes pylons in Suffolk.
Well, they should.
They should, and I'm trying, but they don't know this. So the Lib Dems are worried they're going to struggle in urban areas. I do think the one thing that's kind of propping up the entirety of the British left is the fact that the Tories seem absolutely determined not to learn any lessons from the recent election.
Well, we'll come to that. But first, Zoe, the big question, could the Lib Dems really replace the Tories at the next election as the second biggest party? Is that a thing that you think could happen in this life?
No, I don't. And I think John set out a lot of really good reasons why. I think the fact that the membership does lean more towards the left now. I think also a lot of the vote this time round was obviously tactical, a lot of it based on that we need to get the Tories out sentiment. There was obviously a big uplift in Lib Dem support there because of that. We don't know where the Conservatives are going to fall yet, but presumably they are going to shift to the right to try and stem some of that flow of reform votes. So, you could argue that there is this kind of pro-business, moderate middle class up for grabs. But I think actually at present, Labour is kind of taking quite a lot of that as well. You could imagine the Lib Dems maybe thinking about becoming that sort of Cameron-esque pro-business, low taxation, socially liberal, that slight hold. But, at the same time, Labour have shifted slightly. The membership is leaning more towards the progressive side of things. They're going big on health and social care. Their manifesto is full of actually quite a lot of progressive things, taxation, set of targeted tax rises on the wealthy and big business to fund public services. It seems quite out of kilter with where that whole could be. So I think what is probably more likely is that the Lib Dems are going to occupy a space where they are kind of this constructive challenge to Labour. And hopefully what we will see is a more productive approach going forward.
Yeah, because I was wondering, say that this thing that we're saying is not going to happen did happen, and they were the official opposition. And in some ways you go, well, is that a real opposition if they overlap on so many issues? But it sort of would be fascinating to see what a more constructive approach would be, where it was less kind of Punch and Judy and less I remember as a kid when I first became aware of the news, it was just everything. I was just aware that what the opposition did, which then was Labour, but it's the same deal, whoever's, was that either they would say they didn't like something, or if they did like a policy, they'd go, well, it doesn't go far enough. And I was like, oh, okay, that's the game,
yes,
is it?
Yeah.
And I was sort of thought, wouldn't it be fascinating if you did have a Lib Dem opposition where there was something that was a little more, not quite collegiate, but just less instinctively hostile?
Well, I think almost having an opposition that doesn't actually think there's a realistic or very likely chance of having power. So they're not constantly trying to land blows. They're thinking more about where they position themselves and maybe thinking in the best interest of the country. So you now have 3 select committee chairs who are Lib Dem: health and social care, environment and rural affairs, and petitions. So they've got a much kind of bigger presence in the scrutiny element of Parliament. They said in Lib Dem conference, there are a number of Lib Dems who said we want to be constructive with Labour. We want to actually think about a new way of governing and scrutinising things. You could imagine, potentially Lib Dems trying to pick specific issues like health and social care and trying to push Labour further on that. So pushing them further and scrutinising them on social care plans, for example. And that could be better. I mean, arguably, that would be better for where the country is now than having this situation where the two parties are constantly trying to land blows on each other.
Whether or not you're the official opposition is really important in terms of, how much time you get in Parliament, all kinds of things. We've got sort of a three-party Parliament now in a way that we haven't. I mean, with respect to, obviously, Greens, SNPs, a little bit less respect to Reform. I mean, there are other parties, but you've got kind of the Lib Dems and the Tories are sort of so close together that we do have a bit more of a kind of three-legged stool. But is the system set up for that, or is it still really a two-party system in which the third party is just unusually large? Well, are they losing out? Would they have the right to complain that actually they're not getting enough of a look in?
I mean, when you look at, for example, Prime Minister's questions, which is one of the things the country probably engages with the most, obviously that is incredibly kind of two sides at war. People tend to turn off when the other MPs come in. They like to see the leader of the opposition and the Prime Minister go at each other. But if you look at all the other ways Parliament scrutinises government, select committees, APPGs, questions, there is an argument that the Lib Dems could really do some good work here. And especially, petitions is probably not it can occasionally capture the public if they have particularly interesting petitions to look into. But health and social care, that's going to be massive. And I think the Lib Dems are probably thinking that's where they're going to want to channel a lot of their energy. And maybe they might be, at some point, the go-to voice for journalists on what do you think of Labour's health and social care plans? I'm going to go after the Lib Dems.
Okay, yeah.
But also they're going to be very helpful to Labour by having the Health and Social Care Committee, because Labour were very worried that they were going to that it was going to be their committee, and then that would be extraordinarily difficult because it would mean they were marking their own homework. So having the Lib Dems in there arguing that actually you need to fund this more, we need more money for this, it actually makes it easier for the Treasury to sign off on that expenditure because they're not. Yeah. Does that make sense?
Yeah. So Davey accused the Tories of scraping the bottom of the barrel with its leadership contenders. It's all there is, really, isn't there? The barrel only has a bottom. But surely that's good for him. Like a very right-wing new Tory leader, which is the most likely scenario, would make life much easier for him, right? Because then he can stay in it doesn't force him to kind of like jump either way because the centre ground is still going to be there.
I don't think it makes any difference if there's a very right-wing leader of the Conservative Party or not to Ed Davey. I think that there are worsening economic conditions at the moment. Cost of living isn't getting any better. Anti-immigration rhetoric is amplifying. It's none of these things are curbing. And because they are growing and because you've got two arguably quite centrist parties in Labour and the Lib Dems, all you're going to see are more people moving toward reform. And if you've got a right-wing leader in the Conservatives, more people moving towards that party. During the election, I thought what was extraordinary, when I was going around the country and I was voxing younger people about how they were voting, I couldn't believe the number of 20 to 24-year-olds I spoke to who told me they were going to vote reform. I think that is absolutely extraordinary. It's like what we've been seeing in France with people moving more toward the right because they're unhappy with their current economic conditions.
Well, the Lib Dem Deputy Leader Daisy Cooper took the Tim Walz line on the Tories. Their politics is weird. Their choice of issues is weird. They talk about issues that are not relevant to most people in the country.
I would say that's a bold criticism from a Lib Dem.
But the bad weird, not fun weird, like a Lib Dem. Ava, what can we glean from the Tory leadership race? Are they weird? Do they have a plan? You seem to be suggesting that just circumstances might end up sort of helping them out, even if they don't want to help themselves.
They're just sort of stuck, aren't they? I mean, it's almost like putting in like the VHS and watching like the last 3 years over and over again. Like listening to Robert Jenrick the other day talking about we've got no choice but to leave the ECHR. James cleverly at his leadership campaign event said that he was going to bring back the Rwanda plan. That'd be the first thing that he did. Kemi Badenoch, who is a former Secretary of State is shocked at the state of criminality in the UK. I mean, she just cannot believe that Labour are letting people get away with stealing phones. That surely is Labour's responsibility since they've been in there, since July.
Which has only just started out. No phone stolen before
Do you know what
June.
I mean? But the whole process, he's right to say it's scraping the bottom of the barrel because there's clearly no new ideas in the Tory pot. It is incredibly boring to follow the Conservative leadership race. We might as well be at the last one with Rishi Sunak and Liz Truss. They're pretty much saying the same things now as they were then.
Well, alleged sensible one, Tom Tugendhat, I saw on Twitter, was just, posting this letter that he'd sent about the sentencing for Hugh Edwards, in which not only was the spelling and grammar very poor, but he seemed to have misunderstood the law and sentencing guidelines and the verdict, the actual sentencing. And I just thought, is this what you're doing?
Well, they put you in prison now for not spelling correctly, but they won't put a paedophile.
Did you know he'd been in the army?
He didn't mention that in the letter.
Do you know he also had this? He had this crazy video he did. He went to Kingston and Surbiton, which is Ed Davies' constituency, and he put together a report where he was speaking to people about who are you voting for? Why are you voting Liberal Democrat? And people were just like, we quite like the Lib Dems. And then he posted this on his own Twitter feed. I don't know what point he was trying to make. I'm totally dumbfounded by it.
It just seems to me that you can see where Labour's vulnerabilities are, and you could see where the Lib Dems' vulnerabilities are in these kind of previous Tory heartlands. But the Tories seem incapable of actually exploiting those vulnerabilities. That's what it seems to me.
I think a lot of the problem is just they broke everything.
Yeah.
They're still too close to the moment when they broke everything, and they keep trying to say, "Oh God, look at the state of X under Labour," but everyone knows it was them. And they don't have any solutions to fixing these things, because if they did, they would probably have done it when they were still in office.
Yeah, I think they've backed themselves into a corner because they don't have really anything positive to point to for the last decade to say that we do this, and if you vote us back in, we'll do it again and it'll be great. As John says, they've broken everything. All they can concentrate on, and this was, started under Boris Johnson, is when you don't have anything positive to say, start evoking culture wars. And now it has become the only language they can speak. But the problem is Reform do that better than them. So they really are failing at every part of being a political party.
So I agree with all that. I don't think it's likely, but I don't think it is completely implausible that the Lib Dems could actually overtake the Tories. It would be a freak result, but I think it is possible. They don't need that many more seats, and I think it is possible the Tories are about to implode. I think if that happens, the Liberal Democrats will change into something they have not been recently. I think they will lose a lot of the people on their left. They will be speaking specifically to a particular type of, essentially Cameroon type voter. People who maybe want quite low taxes and would like to send their kids to private school, but also would like the NHS to work. And that is just a market the Tories have stopped talking to.
Yeah, I don't want to knock the Lib Dems, but
I do, it's great.
there does seem to be a feeling where they're basically just like, well, where is our support right now? We'll do that.
Yeah, this is my feeling, that they're just a little bit scattered. They're leaning towards the left. Their membership is of the left, but the space is slightly more towards the right of them. And my worry is if they tried to fill that, they'd dissipate. They'd lose the momentum.
Well, some
built
policy,
up.
they might it's almost like the two sides don't join up on certain policies, because he's talking about winter-proofing the NHS. But then presumably, what if you had to raise taxes to get more money for the NHS? And it's like, well, presumably they wouldn't be in favour of that. So it's sort of like, there are going to be crunch points where you can't do the little left-right dance.
Historically, this hasn't mattered. The Lib Dems have often kind of pulled together voters that do not really belong with the same party, and they've sent completely different messages and completely different constituencies. I think firstly, if they become the official opposition, they can't play that game anymore. But also, so I'm a bit hazy on the details, but I was told that changes to the funding rules mean that more campaign materials are now being funded centrally. And that means you have a single message with Ed Davies' face on it. So you can't just put out completely different policy statements in different seats and hope nobody notices.
So that's what's happening with the planning reforms then. That's why they've had to consolidate. Because, even Layla Moran's constituency, she was she was quite out and proud talking about she'd like to see developments at one point in time. And then her local
She's a
councillors,
massive NIMBY.
I know, her local councillors were like, actually, you've opposed pretty much any development that's been in Oxford for the last however long.
7 years ago, first time I went to Lib Dem conference, I spoke on a housing panel, and it was the first time I met Layla Moran, and her solution to the housing crisis in Oxford was to move to Bicester. And which is conveniently outside her constituency.
The one issue that could potentially unite Lib Dems is obviously Brexit and the EU, but it feels like we're so far away from that coming back in a big way that it could give them a potential uplift. You know, that used to be the thing that everyone thought would give Lib Dems the boost, but it feels like even, you know, very, very pro-Remain campaigners are saying, we need to stop talking about this now.
It's very sad. It's very sad for us former Romaniacs. We're not allowed to talk about it. We've reached the end of the show, so we're going to talk about the stories that have gone under the radar this week. John!
I don't know how under the radar we're talking because it was in The Guardian on Tuesday. But English universities are saying to the government that they will reduce their number of foreign students if they're allowed to raise tuition fees. And if you're of the left, this sounds horrible.
Awful.
It's like, you know, if
Pay,
you let us
pay
do
more
this,
to keep the foreigners out. What a
if
great
you let us
offer.
do this bad thing, we will do this other bad thing.
Yeah.
But it's a symptom of this massive funding crisis going on in higher education, where universities have been using their income from foreign students who they can pay a premium. They've been using that money to cover the fact that fees have not risen in 7 years. So even though it's more than £9,000 a year, it's £9,250 a year. That's worth about 75% of what it was when it was moved to that level in 2017. Things have got a lot more expensive. Universities are going to fall over. This was one of the looming problems Sue Gray listed in her shit list. I do think we are probably going to see a university fall over financially within the next few months. And that could not only ruin thousands of lives, it could devastate the economy of a small town, and we're not talking about it.
Well, mine's a bit of fun, really. This interview on GB News with Choppington, whatever his full name is. And Baynock said, I grew up in a middle-class family, but I became working class when I was 16 working at McDonald's. Now, I didn't know that that's how class worked, and that I was at one point working class. I was working at Woolworths and then again at Primetime Video. And obviously this got, mocked and memed. But I thought it was just an amazing bid because she was middle class. She sounds very middle class. She then went on to work in finance and all that. But I just love the idea that as soon as you get a job, like a normal job, you get to be working class for a bit, and then you can bring that up.
My question is, what was she doing there? And what was she? Because
Shouting at people.
That's a very. It's obviously she's clever. I mean, that's obviously a provocative comment that's going to get people talking. Is there a portion of her voters or people who might vote for her who would agree with that? I just feel like it's so out of step with the sort of thing I thought she'd say about, you can phrase it in all sorts of ways, ambition, class. I'm really confused as to what she meant by that.
I was wondering who she was trying to impress. And she's going, well, I've known struggle. And it's like, well, you had like a part-time job to finance, while you were doing your A-levels.
Yeah, it doesn't make it. It's like, fellas, is it working class to have a Saturday job? Like, it doesn't make any sense.
No.
And it's not as if I'd like to probe her further on it. Was she paying rent in her parents' house? Was she having to support her family off the back of that salary? Then, maybe there's some sense in this.
I think her parents they were still in Nigeria, and that she'd come over to do her A-levels.
Right.
And therefore I don't really know the details, but I do know that class, about which much has been written over the decades and centuries, is a bit more complicated than that.
Yeah.
And that maybe if she did want to go, look, I know what it's like to do a kind of, to have a kind of low-paying, not particularly pleasant job. But just like this idea that this was just how class politics works, I found very strange. I don't know where she thought that there were going to be people out there that might be voting for her in the leadership contest who wanted her sort of working class bona fides.
What do you think this says about my delivery driver job that was at Waitrose?
You see, at first I was like, Ava's working class, but then you finished the sentence and then I was like, middle class again.
I think as soon as you step foot in the van that says Waitrose on it, you're not working class.
It's over.
Yeah, it's over. Yeah.
Yeah, because I did wonder, like, primetime video shops, I don't know the class valence of a video shop. Wasn't Blockbuster, though.
I was a shop girl in a bar in Sheffield.
Wow. I always wanted that job.
No, it's awful.
Really?
Terrible job.
A shot's working class?
I don't know. See, there's too many variables.
I just think you want Kevin Baynard just walking around with like two different coloured post-it notes, just slapping it on, going middle class, working class, and then everybody would know.
Can I just say that even on the expansive Kemi Badenoch definition, I still have no claim to be working class. I'm awful.
Where did you work? In like an art gallery?
I've only ever worked in the fucking media.
You're joking.
Oh, that's
have you really?
shameful. You didn't have a Saturday job?
No, I never had the Saturday job. It's amazing that I'm not a worse human being. just hear the producer laughing there.
John is definitely the posh one.
So what did you do over a weekend then when you were at school? Did you just sit around and like look at maps and things? Like, what did you do?
Basically, yeah.
Wow.
I mean, this was before the internet got big.
I was out there working my fingers to the bone on the tills, trying to keep my community alive. Anyway, more under the radars. Zoe.
Okay, so since we're all trying to find $1 billion down the back of the sofa at the minute, I quite liked this little bit of research done by Oxfam that said if we taxed all the super yachts and private jets in the UK, we could have brought in an extra $2 billion last year.
No way.
So I quite like that, and I don't think for a second Rachel Reeves is going to pay that any attention, but. No. You know, every little helps. And
okay, I don't want to take the side of the super rich here, but surely one of the things about private jets and super yachts is you can move them.
Right. That is exactly what someone who never had a Saturday job would say.
Yeah. Shock, John's taking the side of the super rich. Okay, well, forget that then. Terrible idea.
No, but I'd love it if it worked. It's just like often, like you say, like you talk about taxes and rich people go, oh, well, let's just leave. And most of the time I don't believe it. But when we're literally talking about private jets,
could it be
I think it is possible that will be true.
Okay, what if it was a tax to use I'm going to show how little I understand about aviation, to use the like airspace or a landing strip with
I think it would be something.
I'm on board with that.
You probably see that.
And you have to, pay.
Sea lanes.
Yeah.
But obviously, but the people want their private jets parked here if they live here, because otherwise they need to leave, don't they? They want to use that plane. Or do you mean you think that rich people will park it in Luxembourg and then get it to fly here and pick them up when they need to leave?
Then they need to get a helicopter to the plane that they parked in Luxembourg.
Yeah.
I just think there's some details.
And then you tax the helicopters.
Yeah. Okay, all right, John, we'll stick with what we're doing. Let's go after the PIP payments again. Like, let's crack down on the disabled, you know?
Yeah,
and leave the super yachts alone.
Because you don't want to tax your super yacht pals.
Yeah, good one.
Ava.
Did you know? I'm not going to make this up. Sorry, just like the way I've set that up looks like I'm about to make something up.
Chaotic under the radar. Ever.
So, scientists have decided that it's more healthy for people to drink 2/3 of a pint than a pint. And I thought this story was fun for a couple of reasons. Firstly, because in all of the years that we were in the EU, we managed to retain the iconic pint, right? The imperial measurement of the pint. And that was something that we really held on to with the last death grip. Okay. And now that we've Brexited and we've got our sovereignty, we're going to eradicate the pint. We're going to have 2/3. Okay. We're going Australian. Nuts. The second point of why I found it interesting was this could actually be implemented, because Wes Streeting is banning smoking. He's banning junk food adverts. He's doing the lot. Laughter. He's going to be pro 2/3 of a pint. And I actually would quite like it, because as a pint drinker, sometimes I think if this was a little bit smaller, I wouldn't notice, but I would drink less.
So you're anti-fun?
It's difficult to say. I think that I obviously can't regulate my own consumption, so I think the entire country should be regulated as a result.
There's something in the nanny state.
Maybe that's Streeting's thing. That secretly he's just like addicted to the gaspers, and he's like, the only way I can stop, I can quit the fags, is if I just ban them for everybody. Anyway, that was a free-ranging under the radar.
Sorry.
Very loosey-goosey from everybody there. That's the show. Thank you so much to Zoe.
Thank you.
John.
Thank you very much.
And Ava.
Thank you.